Hello, welcome to another episode of Silk and Steel Podcast. I'm your host, Carl Za. Today we have a very special episode on the US China tech war. To help me, I have a very special guest. He is an insider of US tech industry. For reason of confidentiality, I will refer him as Mr. T. So welcome to the show, Mr. T.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's a real pleasure to be on this show, and hopefully I could help you and your audience sort of get a little bit more clarity on what's been going on over the last couple of years.
Yes, that would be very helpful because I work in IT, but I haven't been working in IT for more than a year now. So I sometimes I feel like a phony when I talk about the latest IT news. So now, obviously, U.S. China tech war is big news, and today is already September 20th in Bali, but it's still September 19th in US. So as of September 20th, Trump is going to ban WeChat, right? And this is a big news. This also will impact many people. So let's talk about let's just talk about that.
Yeah, so it's a situation that's changing around quite a bit. I don't know if you just saw the news, Carl, but it looks like Trump is going to let let the TikTok deal go through. At least there's going to be a sort of a 12.5% Oracle stake, 7.5% Walmart stake. I think ByteDance keeps the other 80. And then there's going to be some sort of IPO in a year. I think both parties may have, both Walmart and Oracle may have warrants to go pick up some more equity. But again, just there, it's not a very specific situation right now. I think there's a lot of details that are still being kept under wraps, but it does look like that TikTok will be let off the hook. Although granted, the Trump administration has only extended the ban on that for 7 more days. I think you wanted to talk about WeChat as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, let's talk about TikTok for now because this is an evolving story, as you say. And originally Trump said he was going to ban TikTok from U.S. App Store, and now it turns into a forced sale of TikTok by its parent company ByteDance to U.S. company, originally Microsoft, and now we have Oracle and Walmart jumping into the fray, and then it looks like ByteDance is actually going to maintain a majority stake. So what's going on here? Can maybe for my audience, can you just go through like the outline of this TikTok ordeal from the beginning?
Yeah, for sure. So TikTok has been the center of some concern by the U.S. administration since 2018, right? As as you might recall, like Facebook originally had tried to acquire Musically, which was the parent application of what eventually became TikTok. But they were unable to do so because of antitrust considerations, or at least they were advised that it would be difficult to get it past antitrust. So ByteDance ended up acquiring that asset, right? And then, ByteDance obviously expanded Musically, merged it with Douyin, used a lot of different, pretty advanced code essentially to enhance Musically and the app and make it something that has become really a viral sensation, right? And the first sort of, you could call it the first successful Chinese technology product within the United States. It's actually sort of 100% created and operated by a Chinese company. And that's caused an increasing amount of concern, both within, I would say, within Silicon Valley, specifically Facebook to a certain extent, and then also more and more within Washington D.C. So there's been some folks within Washington that have sort of said on Twitter or privately confirmed that ever since 2018, at least, the Trump administration has thought of TikTok as a problem. And then through 2019, that got louder and louder, but a lot of it was still kept, sort of far away from, kind of official channels of communication. Then in 2020, you started seeing an increased sort of drumbeat of, calls against TikTok. Now, some of this was actually hinted at by Stratechery, which is a blog that this gentleman in Taiwan by the name of Ben Thompson runs, right? And Ben has been on a sort of an increasingly shrill crusade against TikTok ever since mid 2019. A large part of it is because Ben is very close to Facebook, and Ben naturally, is very pro Facebook in a lot of his posts. But also a large part of it is because Ben is in communication with some members of the administration as well. So he's been sort of an unofficial channel by which people can get a pulse for what's going on. And after India banned TikTok within June of 2020 in response to the Galwan clash and the Indian fatalities there, the U.S. administration felt like either it had a green light or it felt like it needed to sort of one up the Indian side. So they ended up accelerating their demands to really ban the app. And that's kind of been kind of a summary of everything going up to the stage of banning the app. Now, before I move further, did you have any follow up questions to that?
Yeah, that you mentioned the Facebook angle. I think that's that side of the story is not well reported in the media. I mean, the TikTok, obviously the TikTok has many drivers behind the TikTok ban, but Facebook do play a significant role in this. Can you just go in a little bit details about how the Facebook opposition to TikTok influenced the ban?
Yeah, so there's actually a Wall Street Journal article from August 23rd, 2020, which references a dinner that Donald Trump and Mark Zuckerberg had in September of last year. And in the article, it states that in the private dinner at the White House, actually, I'm sorry, the private dinner was actually in October, although Zuckerberg and Trump had another meeting in September as well. But apparently, in the private dinner in October, Zuckerberg had mentioned that the rise of Chinese internet companies threatened American businesses, and that is essentially a bigger problem to the health of the U.S. Republic, essentially, than reining in Facebook. So, if you recall, all through 2019, a lot of people were saying Facebook was a problem for sort of corrupting the democratic process, for enabling the rise of political extremism, et cetera, et cetera. So part of their strategy to avoid antitrust or other content considerations was to sort of deflect the blame back onto China. So not only was this happening in sort of private lobbying, like the Wall Street Journal article attests to, but also in terms of public lobbying as well. So Sheryl Sandberg would go out to Congress and say, "Hey, China's a problem. You shouldn't break us up," etc. Um, and this is kind of an interesting situation because, if you recall back in 2016, back in 2015-16, Mark Zuckerberg was going jogging around Shanghai in Beijing, and he was also he was trying to learn Chinese. In fact, he even offered to let Xi Jinping name his firstborn child.
I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, in an effort to break into the Chinese market. And sometime between 2016 and 2019, Zuckerberg did a 180. He felt that he was never going to get into the Chinese market, so he was going to do everything possible to prevent Chinese consumer internet companies from having a foothold in the U.S. market. And I think his position on TikTok is just illustrative of that sort of larger systemic position.
Yeah, it's interesting because for years, it's the competition really is U.S. companies operating in China, find it harder and harder to compete with domestic Chinese company in the Chinese market. Now, TikTok is the exception that it really gone global. Like you say, it's the first kind of Chinese-made app that seriously challenge like the Facebook dominance of the social media space, right? Facebook bought Instagram, and they really kind of felt the heat from the TikTok capture of the youth market. And a lot of the public talks about TikTok, talk about concern of Chinese government collecting data, on American teenagers. But a lot of that, it doesn't pass the smell test because obviously we know where all the Facebook is fully embedded with U.S. agencies. They all the big tech companies in U.S. are, and we are. And I used to say, like for if you're a Chinese citizen, yes, you probably should be concerned that you might be monitored and surveyed on Chinese social media. But if you're an American citizen, Chinese government have no jurisdiction over you, whereas the NSA that is reading your emails do. So I mean, I think um, a lot of the hysteria that's being whipped up in the media is just that. But what do you think is the motivation for the U.S. administration? I mean, aside from the push by Facebook.
I mean, I think there's a couple of motivations, and you got to unpack each of them individually, right? So there's the sort of commercial competition problem by Facebook. There's also, I would say, sort of, and this is sort of a longer term trend, but with the rise of increasing amounts of data encryption, more and more sort of mass surveillance is done at the application layer, right? It's not necessarily done at the network layer, right? So like way back in, call it the 90s, the 2000s, right? Before people started doing things like HTTPS, TLS 1.3, and other sort of security techniques on a large scale, a lot of traffic, sort of sent across the internet was sent in the clear, right? So if you sort of own the routers and if you own the lines, you could readily sort of collect traffic and do packet inspection and do the things like that to sort of do intercepts or do mass collection, whatever you wanted. And a lot of those programs were uncovered by Snowden and Prism, right? Um, Lately, as web scale companies and consumer internet companies have felt that, hey, like we should just give our users an additional level of privacy. If you want to do that equivalent sort of mass surveillance, you have to actually do it in conjunction with these large application level consumer internet companies. So that would be companies like Facebook specifically, right? Or like Google via YouTube, or like ByteDance via TikTok, right? And that sort of mass surveillance is actually something that the United States SIGINT community actually prides itself on. So it's one of those things where there are elements of the intelligence apparatus within the United States and sort of other closely aligned countries that actually think of TikTok being under Chinese control as a surveillance problem. And as a result, they don't necessarily want to sort of operationally cooperate with a company that's very closely affiliated with China, right? Because that would reveal their operational cadence to a degree to to the Chinese government, right? So they'd much rather sort of be able to seek another solution up to including banning the app or forcing its sale in order to get a crack at that data without sort of having to work with the Chinese.
Oh, so that actually makes sense because I was just gonna say, TikTok Global is separate from the Chinese TikTok. For my audience who are not familiar, there's two entities. There's the Chinese TikTok named Douyin. That's uh, that's for the Chinese domestic audience, and for people outside of China, there's TikTok, right? And they're hosted in different places. So in China, Douyin, servers hold their data in China, obviously. But my understanding is that TikTok US, all that information is actually hosted inside US, right? In the US servers, and it's a separate company, right? Like a U.S. headquartered company. Is that's correct, right?
Yeah, and not only that, the U.S. has actually an interesting law called the USA Cloud Act. Are you aware of that?
No.
Okay, so the Cloud Act, also known as the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, was enacted in 2018, and it allows federal law enforcement to force U.S.-based tech companies via warrants or subpoenas to provide requested data stored on servers, regardless of whether the data is stored in the U.S. or on foreign soil. So that basically means that AWS, Google, Google Cloud, Microsoft Cloud, and Oracle Cloud all have to be able to hand over their customers' data, their cloud customers' data, to the U.S. government, no matter whether actually that customer is based in the U.S. or not, or whether they're even using a cloud region that is within the U.S. or not. So it's actually the type of global surveillance that the United States accuses China of attempting to do via companies like Huawei, like ByteDance, or Alibaba, Tencent, etc. So, but that is essentially the sort of crowbar by which the U.S. signals intelligence community, the intelligence community can now gain access to the types of user data that TikTok would be storing on a cloud provider that is essentially headquartered in the U.S.
So, I mean, in under U.S. law, U.S. intelligence services already have the means to access the TikTok data. You are saying is that they're just uncomfortable to do it in such a way that somehow the TikTok company is aware of how U.S. intelligence go about,
Yep.
coercing the companies to giving up the data, and then okay, so that because that actually, I think that's also related to the Huawei ban as well, right? Because Huawei was big in making up the constructing the 5G infrastructure, and my understanding is that U.S. and the five countries intelligence agencies, they kind of freaked out when they find out that when they're gonna if they invite Huawei to participate in building out the 5G infrastructure, they're going to have to kind of lift up the hood, so to speak, right? And and that they find that unacceptable. Maybe can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's sort of the same thing, right? If you want to conduct a type of even targeted surveillance, not just mass surveillance, you ultimately under a 5G network, you'd have to do it in a way where the 5G vendor itself would have some sort of awareness of what was going on, right? Because a lot of 5G networking devices are cloud managed. So what that actually means is the vendor helps you optimize the network once you've installed the equipment in. So the vendor essentially helps you operate the network. So it's not like AT&T or like Telstra or like like NTT, Docomo, KT, etc. Those companies would just 100% manage the network. Huawei software would be involved in helping them manage that network, right? If they installed Huawei equipment. So if they were trying to use that to do what's called lawful intercept, Huawei would have some awareness of that. And under 5G, it would have a greater degree of awareness than it had under legacy architectures. So that's kind of the context there.
But I mean, for a long time, the U.S. China tech cooperation uh, was going fine, right? I mean, Huawei, they rely on the Qualcomm chips, and they obviously, the Huawei phone, they rely on the Android platform, right? And for a while, US was okay with that. Why they change? Why the sudden shift in attitudes?
It's partially, I think, due to Huawei's increasing technical competence, as well as the changing nature of 5G networks itself, right? So, the thing is, like, under 5G architectures instead of 4G architectures, and this is kind of getting kind of wonky. Um, the RAN itself, so that's the radio access network, or all the cell towers, right, plus the baseband stations. Those things are doing a lot more sort of heavy lifting, you can say, in terms of actually trying to determine how packets get sent around compared to the SP core, right, the service provider core. So even if you tried limiting Huawei to just the RAN, which is what a lot of previous companies did, service providers did to keep the U.S. happy, like that doesn't necessarily work anymore in a 5G world. Huawei is going to have some idea of what's going on. The other thing is that just generally speaking, the U.S. was concerned that if they wanted to do other things with the 5G network, that because Huawei was the only company that offered an end-to-end architecture, so it could offer you the RAN, access, edge, all the way down to the SP core. They could offer you the fiber as well. They had a submarine fiber division as well, and they would offer you the phones as well. That there was a concern that if the U.S. wanted to do anything in an SP that had like a end-to-end Huawei network, that Huawei again would be aware. A lot of this is just due to the fact that the United States just does not want China to be have any sort of operational peek under the hood into what their SIGINT agencies are doing around the world. So
So what we're seeing basically is U.S. is pushing for a full tech decoupling from China, right? Like we're it's a full spectrum banning of full spectrum tech war, right? Banning Chinese infrastructure provider like Huawei to to a social media app like TikTok. But then the TikTok case is very interesting because now it looks like it's not going to be a full-on ban, because there's that forced sale aspect of it. Why do you think is that change? Is it because Trump is essentially a businessman and he treats this as a kind of a mafia transaction? Why do you think that is?
I think it's important to divorce Trump from his administration. I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that at least on matters of technology, Trump is not a hardliner, and he views things very transactionally. Things that Trump tends to get involved in, right? Things like Huawei. I'm sorry, not Huawei. Things like TikTok, ZTE. Um, I'm sorry. What other items has he gotten involved in? Those are the two that come to mind. Are things where there's a lot of bluster, and ultimately the Chinese side gets a reprieve. But things where sort of Trump's administration kind of takes the ball and runs with it. So that would be folks like Pottinger or Mike Pillsbury, Navarro, Pompeo, those guys, where they kind of get the ball and run with it. Those tend to be executed in a much more hardline manner, right? So that would be like Huawei is executed in a very hardline manner. So that's kind of something that I think a lot of your listeners should be cognizant of.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, a degree of difference between company like Huawei and Byte ByteDance, right? I mean, I think because ByteDance compared to Huawei it's much more of a. I mean, both are private companies, but Huawei has more. My understanding, it has more ties with the Chinese state, whereas ByteDance kind of it doesn't really it doesn't have the level of state support that Huawei does because ByteDance just kind of happened by chance. It's just something that happened to succeed. It didn't succeed because of the support of the Chinese state. It kind of
No, not
happened
at all.
outside of it. Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah.
ByteDance has in fact been of the main like the large Chinese tech companies. ByteDance has been like the most anti-government company. Like they expressly have rejected and not worked with the Chinese government very closely. In fact, it got so bad back in like 2016, 17, 18. I think at one point like the Chinese government was even threatening to ban ByteDance's apps inside China. And then they sort of made ByteDance sort of agree to some degree of essentially enhanced content moderation on Total, which was their news app. Back in that time frame. So yeah, they're very much a very independent of the Chinese government type of company, and they still are to this day. Like culturally, so they're like their founder Zhang Yiming is very pro America. He's known for being like that in the Chinese tech circles. I mean, he expressly admires Microsoft. He's a huge fanboy of Satya Nadella specifically. Um, so it's a very interesting situation. Unfortunately, now past I think after this extortionate episode by Trump, you're going to see that ByteDance is going to be very much more closely aligned with the Chinese government, which of course is kind of a dumb outcome for America, but no one ever sort of accused the Trump administration of having foresight.
Yeah, so let's now talk about the WeChat ban because whereas TikTok looks like it's um there is some kind of got some sort of a reprieve, right? Because uh, the latest news is that Trump is allowing the Oracle deal to go through. So looks like there's not going to be an outright ban on TikTok, but WeChat, as I understand, is going to be removed from the U.S. App Store, like as of either tomorrow, or I'm not sure if it says September 20th. I don't know if it's the end of the day or the beginning of the day.
So specifically, what happens is that WeChat is cut off from app stores. It's also cut off from CDNs and hosting providers or internet ISPs, right? So what that kind of means is a couple of things. One, what does an app store actually do for a mobile app? Well, an app store lets you download it, so that means nobody in the US can download WeChat anymore. But if you already have a WeChat on your phone, that doesn't remove it from your phone. But the other thing that an app store does is it keeps apps updated, right? So obviously people are going to continually try to, up, they're going to, you update apps for two reasons. You update them for increased performance and security. Um, and people are going to, over time, users are going to notice the performance of the WeChat app sort of degrade, and users are going to notice basically the WeChat app itself is going to become less and less secure for user data, which actually matters a little bit because WeChat, for some users based in the United States, also functions as a small bank account, right, via WeChat Pay. So that could become problematic for them. Now, in terms of the upgrade, immediately creating upgrade lack, creating a problem for WeChat. iOS is actually, Apple's producing a new iOS system. I believe it's iOS 14, if I recall correctly. Yeah, Apple's going to come out with iOS 14, and within each sort of iOS update, they'll change how iOS works with the applications on top of it. So the app developers have to put out updates to their apps in order to make them compatible with the new version of iOS. Obviously, WeChat can't do that for its users in the US anymore. So specifically for Apple users of WeChat in the US, their experience is going to immediately begin to degrade. Maybe for Android, it might hang on for a little bit longer. Who knows? But that's on the lack of upgrades and being cut off from the App Store. The other big hit against WeChat is really against being cut off from CDNs. So the reason people need CDNs or apps need CDNs is if they're doing multimedia heavy workloads, so things like video chats, that sort of thing, they'll need an intermediate CDN to do caching and compression for that application. So that basically shrinks the video stream before it gets sent all the way across the Pacific Ocean or all the way on a long distance fiber line. And if you can't do that, you're going to find the sort of multimedia heavy experience meaningfully degrade, right? So video calls, for example, between the US and China via WeChat might become next to impossible after September 20th, but you can still send text messages. So that's kind of, I guess, they're relegating WeChat to becoming a distant second class citizen on US phones, by degrading the user experience, the upgradability, and most importantly, the privacy and security of the application by force.
Now WeChat, unlike TikTok, is TikTok is actually primarily used by the Chinese people or the Chinese Americans to keep in touch with their families inside China. I only ever use WeChat to talk with my family and friends either in China or with my parents in the United States, right? And why? So I don't even understand what is the point of banning WeChat in US, because it's such a it doesn't have the kind of impact that TikTok does, right? I mean, TikTok, everybody uses TikTok. A lot of the Zoomers are on TikTok, but WeChat is very specific demographics. It's Chinese and Chinese Americans. So why the WeChat ban?
So I think and I'm just spitballing on this one. I don't really have a lot of insight into the motivations around it either. but I would guess it's around two things, right? The first is that they hope that they can get a bunch of Chinese users, or users of WeChat in the US to migrate to another messaging app, and then force their contacts within China to also download that messaging app, right? What they want to do is they want to sort of, forcibly start cracking open, China's Great Firewall to new messaging apps, right? So that could be one aim, right? Um, but that's a very niche aim, right? Because there are other ways to communicate between the United States and China that don't even involve an app that you can do via. You can do FaceTime, right? Obviously, you don't necessarily need WeChat to do video calls, and FaceTime has never been blocked between the U.S. and China. So that's one, right? The other thing, obviously, is that they could believe that communications via WeChat between Chinese people in the US and people in China are too hard to monitor. Or that, again, if they wanted to monitor those communications, they'd have to work with Tencent. And they don't want to do that. They'd much prefer everybody just go to an app uh, based in another country where they can go monitor it. Something like Line, for example, right, which I think is, I believe, is Japanese, right? So all they have to do is I'm sorry, is Line Japanese? Yes, Line is Japanese, Kakao is South Korean, right? So by migrating it into something like that, they can just essentially force people onto an app that's more easily monitored by the U.S. intelligence community.
I'm sorry. I mean, knowing the kind of the language skills possessed by the kind of the Chinese language proficiency within U.S., I highly doubt they were ever going to be able to monitor the Chinese language communication effectively inside United States. I mean, come on.
Actually, push back on you there, Carl. Like, with the rise of new machine learning techniques, it's actually getting exponentially easier each year to go and do mass monitoring of video and audio communications. So,
I think eventually we'll get there, but I think we're at least 5 years away from any kind of meaningful, like
well, for like, I mean, for if you wanted to go and like the NSA has like a 65 megawatt data center out in Utah, right? Like, they've got massive data centers in Hawaii as well, and it's not necessarily a conspiracy theory to say that the NSA has a substantial amount of compute firepower at its disposal that it can toss at the problem of you know extracting audio snippets or particular text or video snippets from all types of modern communications platforms, right?
well, yeah, that's okay. So for NSA, capturing and storing our data has never been a problem. But I remember a kind of side effect of the Snowden file leak is that and NSA they store all our emails or electronic communication, but data mining is a problem, right? It's actually to get any meaningful data out of all these kind of noise because most of the you know most of the chats are just banters, right? I mean, like it's just signal noise. I mean, it's like I don't believe we are there yet. I think we're at least 5-10 years away from them being able to meaningfully mine any kind of meaningful information out of all these data they gathered. But we digress because I want to get back to the tech war. And now I'm want to like talk about kind of the what possible response by China and what impact on the Chinese companies will be. I mean, first one is Huawei, right? I mean, like
Right.
U.S. is basically out to kill Huawei because not
Yep.
only Huawei, not only the Huawei is it CTO or CFO? Meng Wanzhou was
Yeah. CFO.
yeah. So Meng Wanzhou, right, the daughter of Huawei founder, not only was she detained in Canada, put under house arrest, And but US is also banning Qualcomm from supplying chips to Huawei, and now US is pressuring Taiwan Semiconductors also to stop doing business with Huawei, right? Which is a big problem because Huawei phones, they even if Huawei do their chip design in house, they still rely on foundries like in Taiwan to actually physically make those chips. And right now the US ban means there's no the US ban is actually far reaching. It's not just banning of US companies, but also globally all the companies like Taiwan, right? Especially Taiwan, because Taiwan is basically essentially a client state of the United States. To ban the Taiwan semiconductors from doing business with Huawei. So is Huawei going to survive? That's my biggest question.
So I think it's an open question as to whether Huawei survives. Actually, I think Huawei will survive in some form, but it's an open question as to how much they're going to have their presence reduced by the sanctions. I think the sanctions are going to meaningfully degrade their capabilities in a number of areas, right? At the very least, their top of the line chipsets or whatever is going to succeed the Kirin 9000, which is their top of line mobile SoC, that is going to not that's gonna it's gonna be very hard for them to actually ship any of that, right? So all the effort that the folks at High Silicon, which is their silicon design arm, put into actually designing a successor there, that's just not going to be around. Whereas their competitors like Apple and Samsung will still be able to ship SoCs that are fabbed on 5 nanometer, or in Samsung's case, 7 or 8 nanometer processes. So Huawei's competitive advantage there is going to wither away, right? And it's kind of sad because High Silicon itself last year broke into the world's top 10 of IC or integrated circuit design houses for the very first time. And in fact, they were the first Chinese company to ever break into the top 10 by revenue, right? And that's an accomplishment because predominantly those are U.S. South Korean companies, right? And U.S. or South Korean companies, and that's sort of the pinnacle. You can think of it as the pinnacle of the hardware value chain, right? That's where most of the profits in hardware accrue to. And for a Chinese company to climb the value chain to that pinnacle, that was really an accomplishment. But now they've just been cruelly sort of murdered, for lack of a better term, by these U.S. secondary sanctions, which I think is what you're alluding to. Now they can still work with SMIC. Knock on wood, they can work with SMIC, although the U.S. is still pressuring SMIC, China's semicon foundry, not to work with them. But SMIC is, at the very best, only capable of limited production runs on 7 nanometer, not the 5 nanometer node that TSMC has. So Huawei is going to be meaningfully crimped there. Now, granted, they can still ship a lot of mid-range phones, right? But their consumer business in the top end is probably gonna die, right? It's gonna be hard for them to have that business. As for their networking equipment, which ironically is the area of the biggest U.S. concern, I think they've stockpiled enough chips and components where that's not going to be meaningfully affected for a couple of years at least. So it's kind of strange, but the U.S. is essentially attacking the part of Huawei that where its intelligence community should be least concerned about. But it seems to be a strange. It just seems to be sort of almost collateral damage as part of their larger effort to degrade Huawei's capabilities as a company.
So what you're saying is Huawei's 5G business won't be affected as much as its consumer-facing phone business.
Yes, because the reason you need small semicon nodes is because you need power efficiency. Power efficiency is just sheer amounts of sort of floating point operations per watt. And network equipment is a little bit less sensitive to power efficiency needs than mobile devices, which obviously run off batteries. So that's the main thing there.
Now, I mean, what we see here is, U.S. basically still leveraging its tech dominance into punishing any potential competitor, right? Because U.S. right now, U.S. company Google, Apple, they basically have a duopoly in the platform, right? That in your Android and Apple is a duopoly, right? I mean, you either have the Google Store or the App Store. As the TikTok and WeChat case show, U.S. can opt to ban your apps, any Chinese app from these app stores. And what I mean, do you think China to in response is that going to force China to be more self-reliant and build its own technology stacks? And if China does that, would that does China have enough time to do that and still save these Chinese companies?
So I think I'm going to be real blunt here. My forecast is not all the Chinese companies are going to make it out of this. But at the same time, I think China will be successful overall in terms of essentially gaining full tech independence, you can say, and then also perhaps reaching the leading edge of technology to essentially directly challenge the American tech stack, for lack of a better term. Um, you know, Specific to things like Apple and Google, obviously, if you look at the State Department's Clean Network Initiative, two of the initiatives are called Clean Store and Clean Apps, right? And one is about saying, look, U.S. mobile app stores should not have Chinese apps. That's Clean Store, and then Clean Apps is the other way around, is saying U.S. application developers should not put their apps on Chinese app stores. So that's specific to Huawei's App Store, right? So it's interesting that essentially the Android iOS duopoly, the Apple Google duopoly, is now being enshrined in U.S. foreign policy as like a clear foreign policy doctrine of the U.S. government, right? So it's very clear that the United States is now evolving its policy in that direction. But I do think that China can eventually, sort of replace that and replicate that. I mean, look at the first and the third most downloaded apps in the U.S. right now are Zoom and TikTok, right? Zoom was developed by a Chinese American, right? And TikTok was developed by a Chinese company. And I think that's just a tip. That's just a sort of leading edge of the spear. You're just going to see more and more of these more and more Chinese presence in the consumer internet space as the next couple of years go on. And I think no amount of bans from the U.S. government is actually going to alter that fact. In fact, by forcing Chinese companies to become more self-reliant, they in fact may accelerate that fact and make China a more formidable competitor down the road.
Okay, I'm gonna fact check you for a second. So Zoom is American company, right? I mean, the Zoom
Yep.
founder is Chinese American, but he has American citizenship.
But
And,
most of their engineers are based in China, if you recall.
okay. So do you think Zoom is gonna be under pressure from U.S. government soon?
Well, as long as Trump sticks around and Zoom keeps all of its operations on Oracle Cloud, it looks like Oracle Cloud is the magic umbrella, or Krisha in Russian mafia terms, for protecting yourself against for protecting yourself against this administration.
Okay, so this is a good segue into talking about the durability of U.S. policy toward China, right? I mean, we're seeing a sharp deterioration of U.S.-China relationship under the Trump administration. Granted, course for confrontation was set long before that. I mean, I think it started with Hillary's pivot to Asia back in 2011, 2012, but it's under Trump that this relationship really taken a nosedive. And some of it is because of domestic politics, right? I mean, like obviously, Trump is playing blaming China card to distract all the problems that the U.S. is currently facing. Now we're approaching the election in a couple months. November election is just around the corner. What do you see going forward? How much of this current trajectory of tech war is going to be maintained past November? Following is a bonus segment for my patrons on Patreon. To listen to it, go to Silk and Steel Podcast on patreon.com, where for $5 a month, you will receive premium content like this, as well as early release episodes before they have been released to the public. I put a lot of effort into making this podcast, and I do ask you for your support. Thank you for listening, and I hope you subscribe. Bye-bye.